Topics discussed on this podcast are determined by the Justice Coordinating Commission of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Guest opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Sisters of Providence. To learn more, go to www.spsmw.org.
Welcome to Just Us, where we talk about creating an equitable human community and influencing change. Through shared stories, conversation, and inspiration, we will learn how you can make a difference in your community. I am your host, Jane Fisher. Today's guest, Lori Henson, is joining us in this shared space to discuss journalism today. Motivated by Lori's experiences and insights, let's take action for the common good. Lori, tell us about yourself and your evolution in the field of journalism and what has been the significant impact over the past few years for you.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I love to talk about journalism, and it's been a long path for me since I was even just a kid. I started out as preteen being kind of obsessed with celebrity culture, and I thought I wanted to do red carpet interviews as my full-time job. And then once I actually started doing interviews for the first time in my high school newspaper in Paris, Illinois, I realized that regular people are lots more interesting than most celebrity interviews. So I just really followed that passion and curiosity to talk to anybody who had a good story to tell. And I just really loved the job of going out into the world and gathering information. I always felt like, when you're a kid and you have a doctor's appointment and you get to get out of school and maybe get a Happy Meal on your way back, yeah. I felt like that's what journalism was every day. It was just getting to play hooky and be out of the office and having fun. So when I graduated from Indiana State University here in Terre Haute, I took a job as a reporter in Savannah, Georgia, mostly covering agriculture and business stories from Statesboro and kind of the outer counties. And then after several years there, I went to Idaho for just an adventure and stayed there about a year covering, again, agriculture in Idaho. So potatoes, and I went from cotton and peanuts to potatoes and cattle, and then decided I was pretty homesick, so I came back. And when I came back, this was the late 90s, the impact of the internet was really starting to hit. And working at the Tribune-Star here in Terre Haute, I just saw layoff after layoffs after layoffs, and knew that it was not sustainable, that I wanted to figure out a way to fix that problem. And I decided that at the same time, I got an opportunity to teach a class at St. Mary of the Woods, actually, a feature writing class. My friend Nancy Mayfield was running the program at that time. And I just fell in love with teaching, too. So I decided, well, they say that you have to have an advanced degree to do this for a job. Yeah. So I decided to go to grad school at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I finished my doctorate there and went back briefly for a couple years to teach at the Woods, and then moved to Indiana State. And then after about 12 years there, really saw that journalism was not an investment that higher ed was making, at least not here. And I also noticed that the jobs that would have normally been there for my students that I was preparing them to go do were just not there. Those small newspaper jobs, small market television jobs were just disappearing. And the ones that remained were unpaid or very low paid. And I just thought, I got to figure out how to fix this now, too. So then that shifted my career to working with a nonprofit that does policy work. It's called Rebuild Local News, and we are trying to get policies passed all around the country in states to shift public resources toward journalism, toward
Okay.
the public good of local news.
So that was called
specifically.
Rebuild Local Journalism.
It's Rebuild Local News.
Oh, Rebuild Local News.
And
Okay.
.org, if you want to find it online. And so that's the work I do now, is trying to reinvest some of our public money in the public good of local news.
Okay. You know, we're going to be talking a little bit about finding the news source that we need. And when we listen to news now, whether it's mainstream or other, we don't know what to trust.
Yeah.
Can you help us identify why we're not trusting anymore
Sure.
in general? I don't want to speak for myself, but help us identify news sources that we
Sure.
can trust.
So the issue of trust comes up a lot, and it's a really tough problem because not only are there the normal human obstacles to how to trust information, just am I seeing clearly, hearing clearly, am I understanding this message? But on top of that, we have to fight the fact that there are bad actors who are trying to fool us. And sometimes they're very good at their job. And so, of course, now the technology has advanced so much that they have lots of tools at their disposal to trick us with
Yes.
information that's not accurate. And so it's important to be vigilant and to really think about what you're seeing and where it's coming from. And if it's not obvious where it's coming from and the work that went into it, that's when the red flags go up for me. So news should be obvious in it's the old schoolroom math class adage of show your work, right? Show your
yes.
work. Where did it come from? Who said that? When did they say it? Where did you see that? Where was this recorded? When? And so, getting that level of detail into a story is one way to know that it's maybe more trustworthy. But the best way to know is to simply compare it to all the other things that are around that event or that issue. And so it's by comparing that the outliers become obvious, right? And so I think what is hard for all of us right now is that the work that is involved with being a well-informed person has never been so overwhelming.
That's right.
Yeah, it's really hard. And so I would say it calls for a different attitude, maybe a different disposition toward information. And what I tell people is, because it's so easy to get overwhelmed, I think it's important to take information in doses, to pick an issue or two that you really want to do deep dives into, and keep the rest of it at a need-to-know basis. It's not possible for any one person to know the news for the day.
It's overwhelming.
There's way too much. And again, that's a tactic, right?
Yes.
To overwhelm people with information is a tactic to make them drop out, to make them skip it. And so it is important to stay in the process, but it's also important to take care of ourselves and to know that it's okay, and not only okay, but it's necessary to take breaks, to have a balance of other things. I worry about people who just have cable TV on all day. And what I want them to know and appreciate is that if you watch cable TV for 16 hours straight, you're not getting 16 hours of news. You're getting about 8 minutes of news, like 100 times.
Yes.
Right. And so you're not more informed after 16 hours of that.
Right.
You would have been as informed after 8 minutes. And so I hope people are thinking about their well-being. But again, in addition to look for the signs of the labor that went into that story, was the person there at the scene? Did they see it with their own eyes? Did they hear it with their own ears? Are you getting original eyewitness information, or is this someone's hot take? about someone else's information, right? And that's really where the volume of information is in the hot takes, right?
Yes.
I saw a thing and I have a thought about it. I
Yes.
saw a thing and I have an opinion. And that's where I think people can and should really trim down the amount of information that they're taking in. Try as much as possible to stick to original reporting, and then have a few trusted voices in your media world who seem reasonable, who aren't coming at you with all caps text and emotion and words like crushed, humiliated, devastated, all of those words that are trying to get you riled up. That's another red flag for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder, those trusted journalists that we have, all of us have them, do they fear for their jobs now based on...
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's not concerned about the economics of media right now, the concentration of ownership into a very few handful of companies of our major national networks and national publications is certainly cause for concern. That ownership concentration is starting to happen in broadcast television as well. So there's really no media outlet that is safe from the concentration of power into a handful of companies, but also just in terms of day-to-day safety,
I'm glad you brought that up because you mentioned that the other day when we were talking about, and I always think, do those reporters have to be concerned for their own safety?
Reporters absolutely have to be concerned. And, when I go to journalism events where there are panels and discussions where journalists are learning about their field, now I noticed that there are often sessions and panels about safety, about physical safety, whether that's wearing protective equipment, whether that's, how to organize your news coverage and do your job when police have detained a member of your newsroom or yourself. So there are a lot of those kinds of discussions happening. Certainly in Minneapolis, the Star Tribune newspaper is now an expert in those issues because of their coverage of the ICE raids that happened earlier this year. We just got word today that newsroom is now laying off 65 members of its newsroom, and it seems like the publication is going to shift to a nonprofit structure. And that used to be a pretty fringe idea. There was like one newspaper in the country several years ago that was a nonprofit model in St. Petersburg, Florida. And now there are several major cities whose newspapers are now nonprofit in structure. So we're seeing a lot of shifting and change in the industry.
As a reporter, how do you learn to handle the interruptions that reporters get now? In the past, the reporter set up the question, set up the situation, asked the question, and then the other person responded. And now it seems like as soon as the reporter gets started, we see that the reporter gets attacked verbally.
Right. So one of the troubling trends that has happened over the last 10 years in particular is just the genuine disrespect for journalists and journalism. I think it's, again, partly a tactic on the part of powerful actors who don't want to be held accountable or they don't want to be challenged. And that's literally the entire job of a journalist is to hold power to account. And so that's part of the problem. The other part of that is that in an environment where people feel like they don't know what to trust and who to trust, it breeds conspiracies. And often the heart of a conspiracy is the media won't tell you this, but,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And every conspiracy ultimately boils down to they don't want you to know, but, and the capital T they, is often the media, right? And so in addition to individual bad actors not wanting to deal honestly with journalists, you have this environment that they're swimming in that says, trust no one. The media is lying to you, right? And so that's a really hard thing to combat. And when I talk to people who engage with conspiracies, and sometimes people can be sort of lighthearted about conspiracy theories, like I believe in Bigfoot, and I think maybe the moon landing wasn't real, and they say these things in jest. But I really am sensitive to the idea that this actually isn't funny, because at the heart of all of that is, again, they don't want you to know. And so trying to combat that idea that there's a vast cabal of journalists and media who are hiding things from you is something that really irritates me.
You just mentioned nonprofits, newspapers. That's just and nonprofit journalism. That's a whole new thought to me.
Yeah.
And one of the things we talked about when we first met was, how do we find out the source of the money behind these organizations,
Yeah.
So if I think something's a nonprofit, then just because of my bias, I'm thinking, well, that's a trustworthy source. And so let's talk about sources of money.
The money.
Not necessarily nonprofit-wise, but yeah.
So money is a huge, issue that, again, it's unfortunate that we're at this place where we have to do this digging into financials to know what to trust. But here we are. And so the best way to do that is to simply look at the online source and look for what they're disclosing to you. A good reputable source will have an About Us page online, and they will just tell you, this is our board, this is who donates to our news operations if it's a nonprofit, or if it's a corporate-owned commercial entity, we're owned by this company, and here's the link to the corporate site, and you can see who's on the board and who's the CEO, and so it should be transparent. And if it's not transparent, that's a huge red flag. The other aspect of money is that money introduces a kind of bias, regardless of whether it's intentional or not. And there's a saying that the person who pays tends to be the person who gets served. Yes. And so if that is a, largely wealthy clientele, then the content will cater to that clientele. If that is a, more right-wing or more left-wing crowd, then the stories you see will be probably framed in those ways, right? And so I think it's important, again, to not seek a single source of truth, but rather find who's doing good original reporting, where they're actually present, where the news is happening, and stick to those sources and compare them with others. And that way you're getting a kind of fuller picture of what's happening, because there is no one single source of information that's going to cover every base perfectly, because there's no such thing as perfection in this world, in this industry in particular. Everybody's seeing something from their own point of view, and they're trying very hard, if they're good, to account for their biases. But any of those people would tell you, don't look at just my work, look at other people too. They will bring a different perspective, and that can be really valuable.
Does the amount of money behind a journalist organization, does that influence the quality of the reporting and the writing? And
I think so. I think, certainly, reporting costs money. It is a job that demands resources, and that can be just bodies in seats, and bodies out in in the street doing the work, that costs money. People who do that work have to eat and they have to pay their rent.
Yes.
And so at the baseline, there is a level of cost involved with doing good journalism. And on top of that, there is technology that can be very useful in doing good journalism. We see outlets, one is that I like a lot is ProPublica. ProPublica is specifically an investigative journalism outlet that partners with other newsrooms around the country to do very big projects. And that takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of money to build a database and to, engage experts who can analyze that information. But the information that comes out of it, the journalism that comes out of that is really powerful. And so, it does take money. And that's why, it sounds like, money behind journalism is and automatically like an evil thing. But that's not true. It's not necessarily bad that deep pockets are funding journalism.
Yes.
What we have to assess is whether the journalism itself is of high quality. And again, going back to, did they show their work? How does it hold up when other people look at it? So, and I will say there is one area when it comes to money that I think is worth mentioning, and that is we become really concerned, those of us who are trying to get good journalism funded. There are what we call pink slime websites. I know it's a weird term. Pink slime refers to a story, kind of story that was done about fast food chicken nuggets being made with this meat that's kind of super processed, and they referred to that as pink slime. And so pink slime in a news context is something that has been run through a very shady system. And what we mean with pink slime news sites is that those are essentially propaganda websites that are costumed to look like news. And they often are advocating for a particular politician or a particular political party without being transparent about that. And they've gotten pretty good at masking their true intent. But again, there are ways to dig underneath it. But that's one example of how money is funding some bad things that look like journalism but are not.
Yeah, but are propaganda.
That's it.
And I read that the American Historical Association says propaganda, the battle for men's minds, is as old as human history.
Absolutely.
So we might think it's something new, and it's not, is it?
No, it's not new at all. And, most of what we're dealing with when it comes to finding trustworthy information, there's very little that's new. What is new is the power and technology that is being brought to bear in order to create those falsehoods. So there has never been anything like generative AI that people had access to that could do what we call now deep fakes, where you can take video of a person that's real and alter it to make it look like they're saying things that they're not saying, doing things that they're not doing. And in fact, that's another sign I think people can be aware of in their everyday lives is on social media. That's where a lot of this stuff lives, right? If you see, I have seen very recently people I know sharing political content that was a photograph, and they used it as an example of how bad this person is or how bad this thing is, and the photograph was altered. It was not original. And they mean well, but they are either not savvy or more likely their implicit bias makes them share things that they agree with, even if when you look closely, it's not that accurate. Because in their minds, the larger point is accurate, right? But those little details matter. And I'm one of those annoying people who will say, I hear what you're saying, but that's not real.
Yeah.
And say it with a true picture, not this fake picture, right? And so, yeah, we have to be vigilant. And I feel like those of us who care about high quality information have to help the less savvy ones know what to look for.
Yeah.
And to also understand that a lot of us are vulnerable. We're being targeted according to our age, according to our gender, according to our income, but especially age. There is a lot of political effort put into targeting and scamming older people, people who may not be as familiar with technology or may not be as aware of the latest technology. And so if you know you're vulnerable, if you know that people are targeting you, I think it makes sense to have some trusted people in your circle who can take a look at something and say, that looks fishy to me, right? And I think having that support and community and not just feeling like you're out there all on your own is really important.
It's amazing what they can do when you see this happen to me. The face of a person I trust, and the voice that I'm very familiar with. I've heard this woman speak many, many times, and click on it and listen, and I thought, I don't think she would say that.
Yeah.
But it's her face, and it's her mouth, and I'm seeing it.
Yeah.
And I was like 10 minutes in before I said, now wait a minute.
Yeah.
This just cannot be.
It's amazing.
Just right down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. And it's frustrating to know that our time and attention and our anxiety is being soaked up by this force that, and it's frustrating to know that we're only victim of it because we care, because we're trying to do a good job, right? And the more we try to do a good job and engage, the more vulnerable we are being targeted. And so it is frustrating at this moment. And what I hope is that the more people learn about the tactics that these folks use, because even though the technology has advanced, the tactics themselves never change, right? It's always fundamentally about lying, cheating. That's what motivates these folks. And so there's something reassuring about knowing that their motivations don't change and their tactics don't really change. And that means that we can push back against it.
Well, as we were talking earlier, the word propaganda.
Yeah.
We saw that in history books.
Yep.
And then another one that we're seeing more frequently today is fascism, which we saw in history books, but we're encountering it all the time, aren't we?
Yeah. It's a really interesting moment where I think what I see happening in journalism that I really value when I see it is the reliance and perspective of experts. I feel like, again, one of the tactics of fascism is to undercut all sources of expertise so that the central figure of power is the only source of truth, right? And this degrading of expertise of saying you can't trust science, you can't trust journalists, you can't trust historians, you can't trust these people. What I value in journalism is the folks who are bringing back that context, who are bringing in those experts, and there are experts in fascism that I think I really value. Timothy Snyder is one. He, literally wrote the book on, how to recognize fascism in this moment and created a guide for what to look for. And so he is a voice I trust. And so there are a number of people. I think Heather Cox Richardson is doing a wonderful job. She's a historian, and she's incredibly prolific. I genuinely don't know how she does this, but almost every single day, 7 days a week, she will put out a podcast, an article called Letters from an American, where she just goes through the headlines and puts them into a historical context. It's really incredible to watch. And so there are some trusted voices out there that are bringing back that perspective. And I find that that's also pretty reassuring. It's like there's something calming about hearing, A, this has happened before, you know, B, we are equipped to push back against this in certain ways. And, you know, it requires us to build a community around ourselves, to take care of ourselves, to support each other, and to rely on what we know is trustworthy, which is, you know, the perspective of our loved ones and people we trust, you know, journalists who are showing us where they got their information. And, you know, together, I think we can put together enough good information that we can see the shape of truth, right?
Yes.
We can see the writing, you know, in its big context, in its big meaning. And I think when you can see, you know, where we're headed and which forces are pushing in what direction, then it becomes less important to monitor every detail of every story every day. Like, I don't need to read every Supreme Court decision to know generally where the court is headed, right? I don't need to know every detail of what every congressperson said to know generally what direction they're coming at an issue from. And so I think when you have that bigger perspective from people who know what they're talking about, it actually brings me peace and brings me some reassurance and certainly saves me a lot of time.
Do you see that the focus of journalism has changed? I want to start by thinking about colonial days, and not necessarily journalists as we would define them today, but what people were writing about in colonial days, and even in the Declaration of Independence, the focus that people had. We would now use a term that you taught me, justice focused, even back then, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think what motivated our, you know, founders very early on were these big issues around representation and you know, justice, being having a government that spoke for the people it represents and was concerned with the greater good and not just preserving the power of an elite, right? And so a lot of those are justice concerns that motivated the early pamphleteers and writers. And certainly those same goals motivate a lot of journalists and folks doing what I think of as advocacy journalism, right? So when we talk about advocacy journalism today and what that looks like, and the difference between advocacy journalism and propaganda is, in fact, I just had this conversation with a young person who is very concerned with social justice issues, especially around LGBTQ plus population. And this young person was saying, like, I don't know, I did this video and I interviewed all these people and I know it's not, quote, real journalism. I guess it's propaganda. And I stopped him and I said, you know, propaganda is not concerned with truth, right? Propaganda is only concerned with advancing a message regardless of what it takes to do that. The difference between propaganda and advocacy journalism is still concerned with truth. They are still using ethical standards to collect and gather information. The difference between advocacy journalism and what we would think of as, you know, mainstream journalism is that advocacy journalism has a point of view. They're transparent about that point of view. And again, they're still showing their work, right? This is where this comes from. This is where I got this information. And they're often telling you what the opposing point of view is, right? You know, these folks will say, like, let's just think of the issue that's hot right now, which is data centers. You know, AI requires this incredible computing power that requires a lot of actual electrical power,
Yes.
water to cool the systems, and huge campuses full of machines that can do this processing. And people are starting to push back against the building of these data centers because they are arguing, I think, convincingly, that the building of these centers is having consequences that we are not fully aware of yet. They use a lot of water. They drive the cost of power up. And so if you were advocating for a group that was fighting data centers, that doesn't mean you're not doing good journalism. It can mean that you just are obvious and transparent about the perspective you're coming from. And also, you've done some really good interviews and you found really good research and you found, so I think what we need more of and what I would want people to look for is just people who are clear about their goals, their values, and their point of view, and who attempt to account for that as they're pulling together information. I think that is the most compelling and trustworthy information I see is when I see someone who says, yeah, I come from this side of the political aisle. Absolutely. But I also did all this work.
Yes.
And I know that the other side will say this, and here's how I would answer that. And then they leave it to us to make our judgment about it, right? And so it's really just about having clear, transparent conversations among ourselves as a people, as a country.
Yes.
That's what journalists do, is they give us more information for the conversation, right?
Yeah.
That kind of rhymes. Look at me.
Does. So, we at Just Us are part of the Sisters of Providence who are very focused on love, mercy, and justice. And justice is part of the core of our nation, and I think responsible reporting too. What do you think?
I do. I think every journalist is trained to think about what journalism is for. And in the United States, it has been always about promoting democracy. What do we need to have a democratic system where everyone feels represented? And so that's a core value of journalism. And so I see nothing, I don't see any possibility of doing journalism without that fundamental value of trying to make sure people have information that they need to make decisions about their government and about their lives. And so in that process, we have seen, especially in the history of Catholic social justice teaching, the Catholic Worker is one of the original justice publications that was incredibly influential in its day. But even today, there are other justice-focused publications that are doing fantastic work. And again, they're coming at it not from a propaganda perspective, but rather advocacy and awareness. And some of the projects that I really like a lot. One is called The Trace, and it is reporting on gun violence. And we talked earlier about, the risk of losing good data and good research and good databases that have been collected by the government. And there is, in fact, a law on the books that prohibits states from collecting certain kinds of information about gun violence. Congress prohibited that. That was an effective, move by the gun lobby to keep states from gathering that information. But the Trace is a news organization that does track gun violence at the local level, state level, and they're able to use that data to write really well-informed stories about gun violence in America. And they are an award-winning publication that I really respect. Another publication that's focused on environmental issues is GRIST, G-R-I-S-T. And that publication, again, award-winning journalism on environmental issues, clearly from the perspective of environmentalism and preservation of our natural spaces and clean air, clean water, that kind of thing. There's also a great publication similarly called Inside Climate News. They do a lot of podcasts, and other kinds of media around climate, specifically climate change. Democracy Now! Is probably a publication a lot of your listeners may be familiar with. Democracy Now! Has a lefty political point of view, but they also do original reporting that's very high quality. Amy Goodman runs that publication. One of my favorites of the last 5 years or so is called The 19th, and it's just THE and the number 19TH, the 19th. And it refers to the 19th Amendment, that giving the women the right to vote, but it's concerned with women's issues broadly. And so they're doing fantastic work. They have a good newsroom, elevating and amplifying stories that may not get told in mainstream news. And there's also issues of racial justice, specifically for African American readers, called Word in Black. And it's a great publication that's actually a collaboration of Black-owned publications or publications directed at a Black audience. But Word in Black is a perspective on the news from the point of view of racial justice. And then similarly, Latino USA has...
I'd not heard of that one.
Yeah, Latino USA is another source that, again, is bringing stories around immigration and other kinds of things, issues important to Latino people, into one network of news stories. So those are just some that I was able to pull together.
Well, these are all going to be included in our newsletter.
Great.
As our call to action.
Great.
And you'll hear about in that the trace and grist, as she said. You left us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 places that we can go to. That's great. Tell me real quickly, if you can, all of this discussion that we have had and how that relates to our freedom of press and our freedom of speech.
I mean, there's, I think, a reason why they're all grouped together under the First Amendment. You know, the press, religion, speech, and assembly and protest. And so they're all grouped together because, again, democracy is about preserving a national conversation. And it's about the quality of that conversation is the quality of our government. It's the quality of our society. If we're having real conversations that are informed, that are based in reality and fact, and we're bringing in smart ideas and diverse ideas to hash out our problems and our concerns, then I think that speaks to a healthy country. And when the conversation degrades, when people are not allowed to speak, or there's only certain kinds of voices allowed to speak, or, you know, the press is not allowed to say certain things, that's when the quality of our conversation degrades. And it's not good for our country in lots of other ways, in our economy, in our governance, in our health. There's all kinds of ways that we as a people suffer when the quality of our conversation is not good. So that's what I hope people focus on, is that these things are all connected, and where the press is being oppressed and shut down and restricted in certain ways, that's a red flag that your freedoms are also at risk. And similarly, in a society where certain kinds of voices are not welcome in the public discourse, then the press is not truly free either, right? So the press should exist to amplify voices that are harder to hear because they're less powerful.
Yes.
And the ultimate goal is to make our conversation better and help us find solutions to our problems. Solutions that are smarter, better informed, more research-based. So it all feeds together.
It does. Well, you've made us smarter and better informed today.
Thank you.
And inspired us. I certainly do appreciate it. And thank you, Justice listeners, for sharing this time and space with us today. We hope that you are inspired and have learned from Lori Henson. Are you now ready to make a difference in your own community? If not now, tell me when. And we hope you have enjoyed this episode and will share it with others. Please leave your comments and review and any suggested topics at www.spsmw.org. Just Us is a production of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Producers are Susie Ray and myself, Jane Fisher. Our associate producers are Dr. Perlette Springer and Sister Barbara Batista. Please view and visit www.spsmw.org/justus for any suggested topics you might have, and please share the podcast with your family and friends. Thank you.